Hi, I'm Benton Stokes.
And I'm Elane O'Rourke.
And this is Cocktail Theology. Hey, how are you?
I am good.
Yeah?
Yes, we are having probably the most thematically correct cocktail we've ever had as we recorded one of these.
Really? How is that?
Yes. So we started with the Amelia Earhart.
Yes, a favorite.
A favorite. And here's the thing. We didn't have the right gin. We didn't have violet simple syrup. The only thing we had that's actually in the original recipe is Indian tonic. Mm-hmm. Oh, well, we had lemon zest too.
Okay.
What we had to do was think about what the flavor profile was and then kind of take it apart. So instead of the Uncle Val's, which we love, we had Bombay Sapphire, mm-hmm. which we also love, but it's quite different.
Different, right.
Instead of violet simple syrup, we had a violet liqueur, a very dry one. Mm-hmm. So we had to kind of take it apart and then put it back together in a way that would work.
Yes.
And so we have a really lovely cocktail that is almost the Amelia Earhart, but has been, let's just say, reconstructed.
I like that. Reconstructed. The essence of it is kind of there,
Yep.
But it has different components.
It has different components, and it comes out differently, but still delightful.
Still delightful. It is beautiful, and it's delicious.
Yeah, the color is pretty extraordinary.
That ties in so brilliantly with what we're talking about today, because
Doesn't
we are
it?
talking about deconstruction and reconstruction. Deconstruction is a term that we're hearing a lot. Correct me if I'm wrong on this, but the way that I understand deconstruction is that basically when you have a faith crisis or something that causes you to need to reevaluate, mm-hmm. you basically strip everything away mm-hmm. and start over.
That is often the way it is done, yes.
Okay. And I have seen comments from people online that are in the midst of deconstruction, and they're talking about things that are what I would consider pretty foundational and mm-hmm. basic to a Christian faith, mm-hmm. kind of being called into question or maybe mm-hmm. even made light of a little bit. Mm-hmm. And I know that in our work, sometimes we kind of hold people's hands as they're walking through a process not too unlike this.
Yes.
But I know that one of the things that we often encourage people to do, well, not often, always, encourage people to do is to hold on to that core mm-hmm. as they deal with all of the peripherals. Mm-hmm. So that's why when we were talking the other night, mm-hmm. This conversation came up. I just thought this would be a great conversation to have with our listeners, because I think deconstruction is such a kind of a pervasive term among people that are maybe in or coming out of evangelical land and trying to make sense of what makes sense anymore.
Yep.
I think we're seeing a lot of that. And we're seeing that from people who have been kind of burned by
yes.
traditional church
yes.
in some way.
Yes.
And we know that there's a contingent of our listeners that kind of falls into this category.
Exactly.
Often queer people fall into this category
yes.
because out of necessity, they're having to reevaluate how their identity and their faith are going to merge or work together, and where they can be affirmed in that.
Yes. Okay. So, as is my wont, I'm going to make some distinctions here.
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah, please do.
So that notion of deconstruction started with linguistic philosophy, or philosophy of language. Okay. Mm-hmm. So it started with the idea that language really shapes how we understand something. And it also deals with the historical construction of an idea. So what deconstruction did was say, okay, we need to look at all of this. We can't read a text or understand an idea without context, without language analysis, without the kind of stuff that you and I do all the time for School for Seekers without thinking about it.
Yeah.
But it was really radical at the time.
Yeah,
Okay?
I can imagine it was.
Yeah, it was hugely radical. And when I was working on my doctorate in philosophy, which I did not finish in case anybody just suddenly leapt out of their chairs, for all kinds of reasons, including they didn't have a way for me to do applied ethics. And I thought, what's the point of ethics if you don't actually apply it? Anyway, so it was really huge at that point as an academic discipline.
Okay.
Deconstruction was huge. And then it kind of disappeared for a while, right? And then I completely agree with you that as it's come back in a sort of a different form. I think there are two extremes of it right now. One is deconstruction in the sense of, let me take these things apart. Let me see what I still believe, what I don't believe, what that means, what it means to me, just kind of really looking at all the Legos, right? Then there's the one that says, I am going to take a hammer and knock this stuff down, okay? I don't know that this is true, but my guess would be that the knockdown people are people, and particularly in the church, are people who've been actively injured by the church.
It would seem so, yeah.
Not LGBT period, and I'm leaving out Q for a minute, but LGBT who have been injured for that by the church, or people who've been sexually abused by the church. But all those things where there's been some actual trauma, I am seeing a tendency to take a sledgehammer to it all and call that deconstruction. That's not what I would call deconstruction. It's perfectly legitimate, perfectly fine. It's not the word I would use.
Yeah.
On the other hand, you've got people who are like taking things away and looking at them. In fact, I would probably even go farther than you did. I would say that often in deconstruction, you have to kind of dump core even. Not forever, but set it aside and say, okay, what do I think is core? Well, maybe I think the Bible's core. Well, maybe I need to look at that.
Yeah.
So you go towards experience, you go to listening to other people, you don't completely dump the notion of God necessarily, but you explore how your view might not be exactly what other people's view is, and why would that be?
Right.
Right. And so I liken it a minute ago to taking a look at the Legos, right?
Yeah.
If you take apart something that a kid has put together with Legos, and you're trying to figure out how they did it, you take it apart and you look, and you take it apart and you look, and you lay it out all so you can see all of the various pieces, and then you rebuild it or build something else new. That's the part that makes me very nervous when people deconstruct, is that they don't reconstruct. So they're left surrounded by rubble and nothing in between. That makes me nervous.
Yeah.
And it seems to me the louder voices of that particular sector of deconstructing, often wind up being just angry. Because once you've broken down something, you generally need something to help you see farther, to have a greater vision.
Right.
It doesn't have to be the same thing remade. It could be something else entirely. But that working through the pain, working through the struggle, working through the anger, working through all of the completely legitimate feelings and experiences usually requires our having some kind of vision, some kind of, this is what I want my life to be like. This is how I want to feel. How do I get there?
Right.
So that's the thing about Reconstruction for me, is it's not necessarily, okay, I'm simply going to take out the virgin birth and then now I'm done. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that the healthiest deconstruction and reconstruction I've seen has really been mostly a shifting of perspective. By the time they wind up, it's a shifting of perspective. And I would say that our acquaintance Derek Webb has done an amazing job of walking through this. And he's done it publicly so you can see it. But that really deconstructing, really dumping it, and then finding a way back into relationship with the divine in some way that has some vision, has some connection, has some bigger than I am-ness.
Yeah, I think because we are hearing so much about deconstruction, we're not hearing so much about reconstruction. In the work that we do, we are helping people reconstruct. Once the Legos are on the table, then we're inviting them to try on this red Lego where there used to be a black Lego. And so what does that feel like? How does that fit within your experience of God?
Right.
And I think that's just so useful. And I know that many people are terrified to walk through this process. People who come to us are often like, is God going to strike me with lightning if I question any of the tenets that I was raised on or whatever? And of course, we're always encouraging people to to be sensitive to the Spirit and what the Spirit is telling them to do. And I do think the Holy Spirit is an important part of this process.
Yes, I would agree.
It can't be simply intellectual.
And I don't think you should do it by yourself.
No, you definitely shouldn't do it by yourself. So I think the reconstructive part is just so important, even down to like, I know that we have some listeners here that would probably identify as exvangelical, but I'm finding post-evangelical as maybe a more useful tag for many because they aren't like scrapping everything.
Right.
But they have moved beyond
Right.
the parts of it that don't work for them
Right.
and don't make sense for them anymore. I mean, I suppose you could use that term for, postmodern's been around a long time.
Yep.
You could say, post-Episcopal, post-Catholic. I mean, whatever
Right.
it is that you're moving on from.
Yes.
But you're moving into something else. And I think that is so useful to say, you've got that thing out there.
That's right.
And it's like you can picture the life of the Spirit in your life looks like that.
Yes.
Well, how do I get there? What are the things that are tripping me up to keep me from experiencing God in this way?
Right. This is going to be a crass comparison, but I'm hoping it'll be useful.
Okay.
So for those of us who have had sexually traumatic experiences, we've been raped or abused or whatever, I think that most of us in our process of healing are not looking to become celibate forever. That's not our goal. Our goal is to find a way to be whole and healthy and include a healthy sexual life within that. I think that's the piece that's important. And because, again, particularly people who've been specifically abused by the church, because pastors, priests, churches have so much psychic influence, it's really hard to think about how that could look different for you.
Yeah.
That's why I think that in some ways, comparing it to a different kind of trauma or a parallel trauma can be useful for understanding that you will need to get away from the thing that harmed you. Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I hope that your goal would not be to return to church. That's not the issue. It's the taking God out of the church. It's taking your spirituality out of your sexuality out of the, all of those things, the itties of us out of whatever that location was. I think that's the thing that I hope for better as people move through their healing process. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So if one were abused by a pastor in the church, you don't go back to the church, you don't go back to the pastor. You may wind up dumping a whole bunch of stuff like that, and you may wind up adhering to Buddhist spirituality. Fantastic.
Right.
Great. Do that. But don't dump the fact that the world is bigger than you are.
Yes.
And that you can heal. You can heal from things. That's the reconstruction part. So it may not even always be reconstruction so much as new construction, or where maybe you started with Legos but now you're going to use Lincoln Logs.
Lincoln Logs, I was going to say.
I don't know, whatever. It's really hard to stretch this analogy long enough. But maybe it's more like that.
Yeah.
But I would hate for people to lose that essential part of themselves that is connection with the divine. It is connection with each other in a different way. I would hate for people to lose that completely. I'd rather have them find a different way to have it.
Yeah, me too. I know in my own experience, when I went through my divorce and started going through the coming out process, kind of, I guess, I was very concerned about how this was going to impact not just my faith, but also my church life. Church, as many of our listeners know, church has always been a huge part of my life, and it was a very formative force for me in music, because it was the first place where I shared songs that I had written. It's where I learned how to play the piano. I was accompanying hymns in our church from a young age, and so church was such a part of the fiber of my life that I was terrified that I wasn't going to have church in my life anymore.
Sure.
And sidebar, I really do experience church and God separately and different. Those are different experiences.
Yes.
Which was something else I had to learn. But I think that through that process, I really did sort of dither my beliefs down to just sort of a very basic core, and then began building on that core, and we're talking nearly 20 years ago now, and I'm still building on that core. It impacted, my worldview. It impacted my politics. It impacted, so much the way I parent, the way I tend to my relationships. Everything was touched by that process. And I do think that if you're doing it in a meaningful, lasting, impactful way, it will touch everything.
It has to, because
Right.
we're connected beings.
Right. So it's not like you can take, your spiritual life like it's a drawer and take it out and dump it on the bed and leave everything else intact.
Right.
It's not like that.
Absolutely.
It touches everything.
Absolutely.
So I think while we encourage this kind of sort of self-evaluation all the time, we also want you to be mindful and careful and spirit-guided as you're doing some of this work, because otherwise, like you said, you're just swinging a sledgehammer at stuff, and then you're just left with debris all around.
Right. The other piece of this is whenever you're deconstructing any major chunk of your life, therapy is useful. Spiritual direction is useful. Wise friends are useful. Like all of those surrounding pieces are useful as you are literally taking it all apart and making sense out of it, making sense of yourself, making sense of your experience. We have 2 courses that really talk about this stuff in a very different way. One is 17 Embraceable Ideas.
Great course.
Right? But what we start with is God is. Forget everything else. God is. You can use whatever name you want, but God is. Let's start there. That's, for me, that's one of those core things.
Yeah, for me too.
Okay? And the reason I think it needs to be a core statement as you're working through this is if you dump that one, there's really nothing to work through.
No.
You just kind of dump it and you say, okay, there is no God. Now I just need to look at the horrible human beings I've dealt with. Okay. And that's a choice, but it doesn't reshape your spirituality.
Right.
That's not, yeah. Then the one that comes along pretty closely after that is never believe anything bad about God. And what that means is if your understanding of God in a situation makes God less loving in the way we normally use the word loving than your best friend, it's probably not God.
Yeah.
So if you can get those 2 going, the rest can be unpacked. Right? The other course that we talk about this in is the 6 steps and 1 wall of the spiritual journey. And what I find often happens is people hit that wall. They hit whatever wall it is, whether it's a divorce or deciding to address sexuality or dealing with abuse or whatever that is. And they come up against the wall and they're so afraid of what might be on the other side of that that they just back way up.
Yeah.
And stay doing the same things they were doing. They never deal with it. And they keep hitting the wall and they keep backing up and hitting the wall and backing up. So, with our experience of LGBTQ stuff, it's, the person who stays permanently closeted and is aggressive towards other LGBTQ people, right? Or the person who stays in the church that abused them because they know that if they leave the church, they lose all their friends.
Yeah.
That's real, and that's part of the human experience, and it's one of the reasons that doing the kind of work that we do can be really hard, and why I think support is critical.
I agree. Would love to hear from our listeners on this. What have you guys experienced of deconstruction? Have you gone down the road to deconstructing your faith life? Or maybe you are dealing with questions about your church or the theology of your church and having some real problems right now with what's coming from the pulpit or what you're reading online that's in line with your church's doctrine. And maybe deconstruction is something that you're afraid of, but you feel like it might be inevitable if you're going to stay in relationship with God, because sometimes that happens. You just kind of become a corpse at church.
Right.
And there's no life there because you don't really believe what's being taught anymore,
Absolutely.
and it doesn't resonate anymore. And so we would love to talk to you if that is your experience. If you realize that what your church is teaching you or where you've been turning for spiritual guidance isn't working anymore, if that's not resonating with your spirit anymore, then we would love to hear from you because we can help you, frankly, with that. Before we close, a success story of ours that we love to share.
Yes.
We had a friend, I don't think she'll mind us telling her name is Pam, and Pam went through School for Seekers with us when we were just first starting out. And she got the itchy sweater thing that happens sometimes when truth is revealed to you in a way that you weren't expecting, and it drops kind of on your head, and it's like, well, dang, I got to deal with this now. She made the decision to convert to Judaism after spending a good deal of time with us. And we rejoice over this because she found the spiritual journey that she needs to be on. Mm-hmm. We can waste so much time, energy, heart, going down a road that was never actually meant for us. And so in that way, I think what we're talking about is so important and so valuable, but it is important to do it in a way that is thoughtful, spirit-guided, and supported. So we would love to help you with that, if that's something that you would like to talk about. You can email us always, Elane, Elane, or Benton, Benton, at schoolforseekers.com. If you have questions about any of this, we would love to hear from you. And if you'd like to share your experience, we would also love to hear that as well. We just think this stuff is so important. And because deconstruction has become such a buzzword, I think it's important for us to remember what that is and why we do it and what the end result of that really can be and look like. I totally understand wanting to burn it all down. And as Elane said earlier, if you've been in abuse or trauma, then I fully understand, just want to take a match to the whole thing. Mm-hmm. But we would encourage you to remember that God is good, not just good, but holy and deeply and truly good. And that believing any of this is God doesn't serve you. God is much bigger than that, and God is much more loving than that. Anyway, anything you want to close with?
No, I don't think so.
Fair enough. Well, I'm going to enjoy my beautiful purple drink, and we really do enjoy this. If you guys are enjoying it as well, I hope you'll share it with your friends and loved ones. That's how we grow this audience. Thank you for listening. We'll catch you next time.